Okay, so you can see this is the video that I've included down below. It's basically just me with a piece of paper that I drew some X's on, camera tracking around this little table. And so that we're basically just going to add a super simple object to the table there. And so what we want to do first is to camera track. And so for camera tracking and really like visual effects as a whole, we want to be working in image sequences because image sequences are much more compatible between programs than video files. And also video or image sequences are not tied down to a specific frame rate. So say if you shot in a 60 FPS or a 30 FPS, we can actually be working in 24 FPS throughout the entire visual effects process. As long as we do our final export in the correct FPS, it'll be much more beneficial and won't cause problems that frame rate actually creates. So in order to convert videos into image sequences, we can come up to plus. We want to go to video editing. And then if we add our movie, here is our clip. It's just 1-2. And so let's open up the movie strip. You can now see that we have this movie strip in, and then we're going to come to the very last frame, which right here is 198. And so let's go ahead and copy that and paste it in our last kind of end frame down here. If you want to see that, that's where I'm just pasting those. So again, 198 for that. So that is now the correct frame rate of our footage. You can see whenever we import in footage, Blender actually does a good job of automatically correcting for the frame rate. One thing I do want to call to attention real quick, because this is going to be something that we're going to be working with constantly throughout this course, is that the color management is actually set to standard. And so standard is the kind of best view transform for any videos or image sequences, or basically any 2D plates that we're going to have. And then AGX is the default, is actually the best for CGI. So now if I have it on AGX, you can see that all of the whites are very kind of washed out and gray looking. And so again, whenever we're working with 2D stuff, we want to be on standard. And so I'll constantly be reminding you guys as there's a particular way we have to work with that inside Blender. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and come to the output properties. Let's go ahead and output this in a specific file location. Regardless of where you're actually saving stuff, we want to name this. And so let's go ahead and name this. I'll just name this like footage or whatever you want. I do want to put a underscore at the very end just so we can separate out the frame number from the actual name of the file. You can see that I have all these images sequences here. So basically, when I put a underscore at the end, it's going to put these numbers after this underscore. And so it's just a good way to kind of separate the text from the actual number that it's going to generate. So let's hit accept there. And again, we're going to want a image sequence. So by default, it's set to an image sequence, which is good. We have PNG. You can also do OpenEXR or even JPEG if you want to save on some space. However, that does introduce some compression qualities. So let's stick to PNG. We don't need an alpha channel yet, so we're going to do RGB. And so finally, down at this compression section, I believe PNG is actually a lossless format. And so all that means is that no matter what we set here, the image is actually not going to look different. And so all this number does is basically just save you file space. However, it does increase your render time a little bit. So play around with this number and find a happy medium for you. For me, I just like to keep it on 15% since I don't really worry too much about file size. Of course, you could go all the way up to 100%. But that might increase your render time by a lot. So just play around with that number there. So once we have all that set up and your kind of location that you want to save it to, let's go up and render the animation. Okay, so once that finishes rendering, let's come up to File and then New and General. And we don't need to save this since we can always redo it if we need to. Okay, so now let's do our first ever visual effects shot. So let's come up to plus, VFX, and then motion tracking since we actually want to camera track our footage. Let's open up that sequence that we just created. So here is my image sequence folder. You can see that I've named it this and then I have that underscore with a frame number at the end. So we have basically frame 1 to 198. And so that is perfect. We need to go ahead and hit A to select all those and open up the clip. Now you can see that we're having that issue like we had before with the color. And that's because in this workspace, it actually doesn't automatically detect the color for us. So we have to go up to render properties, down to color management and set it to standard. And so now we're in the correct color transform for this 2D image sequence. So in order to camera track, what we can do is come up to the tracking tab. I can set the scene frames just to set the start and end frame down here. And then if we prefetch the footage, you can see this bar kind of increase. And all that's doing is just caching in all of our frames into our RAM, just so it's a little bit smoother to actually play back our footage. And so now for camera tracking. So camera tracking is a whole beast of a thing, and I actually have a whole dedicated chapter for it. So I'm going to be skimming over a lot of stuff. However, this is a super simple scene to camera track. So I feel like you guys will pick it up pretty fast. And so the biggest thing that we'll need to know is we need points of high contrast that Blender is going to be able to camera track and track throughout our entire footage to tell where the actual 3D points are going. And the other thing that we need is at least 8 markers throughout the entire track at one single time. And so that's going to be super easy to achieve inside of here. And so those are really the two main requirements for camera tracking for Blender. And so let's come down here. You'll see that I have all these X's. If you hold Control, we can actually click and add a track. And then I actually like bringing up this track window up here so we can see the full tracking marker. If you hold Alt and then hit S, we can reveal the search area. So if I come over here, we have some of the settings. We have the pattern size and search size. The pattern size is the smaller box right here, and then the search size is the bigger box. And so the smaller box is what we're actually going to be tracking, and then the search box is where we're going to be tracking that thing throughout the frames. And so say if you have a super fast motion camera, the camera is moving a lot, you would need to increase the search size because between frames, this box might have changed from here to like over here, for example. For our scene, it's super simple, so we don't really have to worry too much about that. Okay, so let's first of all, I want to increase my pattern size to a 35. If I control click that, you can see that now our pattern size is a little bit bigger. I want to increase my search size to, let's say, like a 90, just to increase that search area a little bit more. So now this is what we're going to be working in. That's totally good. So let's come out of here, delete those. And what I want to do is tell some of the tracking settings for Blender. Now, on 90% of the shots I use, I always change it to match to previous frame, just because I find that that works a little bit better with the Blender algorithms. And then also normalizing our footage. Now, normalizing is basically going to average out all of the exposure changes. Say if you have a flickering light, or if you have some bright sunlight comes out through the clouds and stuff, it's actually going to change your exposure values of a clip. And so normalizing it is basically just going to try to eliminate all those changes as much as possible so that Blender doesn't jump around and think another tracking marker has changed throughout the clip and stuff like that. So now we can go to the tracking settings section. I like to set the correlation to a 0.9, and all that means is basically Blender has to be 90% sure that the tracker is correct for it to actually continue tracking. And so now let's go ahead and add some tracking markers. Now that we have all these settings kind of figured out, we can hold Control and then click the center of all of these X's right here. I just want to click some of those. And add all of these. I do want to try to be in the middle of the X as much as possible, because if any of the markers actually mess up, then we can manually kind of place it in the exact middle here. We can also get some other parts of the clip as well. And so I'll notice there are these edges of the paper might be good and good data for Blender to actually use. So I'm going to get all of the edges of the paper like that. And then we actually have some patterns down here. So I might actually try to get some of these kind of dots in the wood and stuff like that. There's this white little dot here. We'll see if Blender can track there. And then like some patterns in the background. It's always just nice to kind of visually do a pass and see any kind of unique things that Blender might be able to attach to and, get a good track like that. So we'll put one there, and then that looks pretty good for my specific scene. So let's go ahead and hit A, and we're going to go ahead and Control T is the shortcut to actually track those forward. Of course, you can do the tracking buttons down here, but Control T is the hotkey there. So now you can see our tracking markers have tracked throughout our footage. We do have some that failed, which are these red boxes right here. We actually have one of those that failed is one of our X's. And so if we do want to kind of manually set that, all we need to do is click this tracking marker down here. We can go to the frame that it failed, and you can see this is where it is. So we need to position that on the next frame exactly where that is. So on the next frame, if I go a frame over, you can see that it failed on this frame. Let's just G, and then I'm going to move it exactly where it was before. So right there, and then I'm just going to hold Control T and then track that forward again. And now since we actually manually told it that's where it is, it went ahead and was able to pick it up for the rest of the frames. And so just a nice little way to manually kind of detect some of their and fix some of the tracks that might go off. Some of these up here actually go off the screen, and so that's why I'm not going to really try to fix those up there. Okay, so now that we have all of these points defined and tracked and everything, of course, they are actually not doing anything because we haven't told Blender to automatically calculate where they are in the 3D space. And so to do that, what we can do is come to the Solve section over here. And so first we need the A and B keyframe. The A and B keyframe is basically the range where there is a lot of camera movement in our scene. And so what I'll notice is that around we'll say 50 to frame 80 is where the camera moves a lot. You can see that there's a lot of movement here. So what I'm going to do is set A to 50 and then B to 80. And so now you can see these green lines right here, and this is the range where we actually have some good movement for Blender to calculate. Now right here we have some things that we can redefine. Now you can totally redefine these if you don't know these values. I'm actually going to go ahead and plug some of these values in since I did record some of this data. So down in this track section, we can go to the camera. We want to come down to this lens section over here. The focal length I shot in was a 26 because I shot on a iPhone. And then we can just leave the optical center and lens distortion down here to 0, since this really doesn't have a ton of lens distortion, and that might get a little bit too involved for our specific scene. So now with all of these settings kind of here, we can go ahead and solve the camera motion. And now it's given us a solve error of a 0.61. And so that's actually pretty decent. All that means is that we're basically 0.6 of a pixel off. And so, a pixel is so small. So we're about, half a pixel off, we'll say. So we want to try to get that number as low as possible. And so what you could do is you could come down and clean the tracks and try to, solve some stuff there. Now for this specific scene, I'm not going to really deal with it since 0.6 is actually a pretty decent solve error, but we'll get more into that in the camera tracking chapter of this course. So now that we have all of this ready and, ready to actually get into the 3D scene, let's set up the background and set up tracking scene like that. And if we bring this window down, now we can see in our 3D viewport, we actually have some boxes and some dots and stuff like that. So let's go ahead. I'm not going to be using this window right here, so I'm just going to join the area so we can see this section a little bit more. So now if I come out of here, you can see that we have all of these dots out here, and they're, flat along the table. That is looking good. However, they're not actually on the 3D floor plane of our scene. So we basically need to tell Blender these points right here need to be on our ground plane, or basically where this box is selected right here. So let's come back into the camera view. Now for the floor, we basically just need 3 points on the floor plane. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select like 3 points on our paper right here. This is where I want the object to be. So I'm going to select 3 points around that object, as close to that object as possible that are on the floor plane. So with these 3 points selected, let's go to floor. And then right here, I'll set this middle point to be the origin. And then this point right here, since it's along that line, I'll bring it as the x-axis. So now it's basically rotated in our scene pretty nicely. Now we do want to do the correct scale now, since scale influences focal length, ambient occlusion, lens distortion, all of that stuff. And so what we want to do is we want to select 2 of these points. And if I think about the real world, a piece of paper lengthwise is about 11 inches or so, right? And so if I take about, there's about an inch off here and then an inch off here. And so that's about 9 inches. And so 9 inches converted to meters, since, Blender works in meters, that conversion is about 0.2, roughly around there. And so what we can do is let's go set scale, and then we'll do 0.2 right there for the actual conversion. Of course, you can pick whatever points that you want. I just picked those since those I know for sure are kind of close enough. You could also do this point and this point and set it to be 11 inches, which is like 0.3 meters or something like that. So now that we have that, we can come out of here. We can come out of layout view, and now we have the camera set up, the correct scale and everything there. What we want to go and do is delete some of the stuff that Blender automatically set up, such as they added some of these collections. So I'm just going to delete those collections. Also, the foreground and background view layer. That gets a little bit more advanced into it than we're ready for yet. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the background view layer, come up to compositing. Since we don't have any lens distortion, we didn't define any of that. And also we deleted one of our view layers. We can delete these 4 nodes and just plug the image into the image of our alpha over, just so we have, again, kind of this default compositing in here. So let's come back out to the layout tab. We can just go ahead and delete everything. I'm going to start from scratch for this specific part. So we basically have the camera right here. What you could do is you could come down and change the opacity all the way up just so we can view a little bit easier. But I want to go ahead and do some tests to make sure that our camera track is working and, looks good. And so let's go ahead, Shift A, going to add a mesh. We'll add a cube. Let's go ahead and come to the side. I'm going to go into edit mode. So tab, GZ control, snap that up until it's on the floor. And then now we can just S to scale that down, and it should, in theory, track along with our scene. And so now you can see our box is tracking with the kind of camera, and it's being placed onto our little surface right here. And so that looks good. You just want to make sure you get a nice camera jog here. You shouldn't have too many problems if you did follow along, as this shot, again, is kind of the best case scenario there. So let's go ahead and delete that. I want to go ahead and mesh, we'll add a plane just to get our shadow catcher back. Of course, before I do anything, let's come up here and change it to cycles, GPU compute, denoise on, denoise off, then 128 and 1024. You're going to get sick of me going through that, but again, those are kind of just the default settings there. So let's place a monkey on the floor plane. So let's come to the side view, Shift A, we're going to add a monkey. And then this time, the monkey is very kind of blocky and stuff. Let's go ahead and add in a subdivision surface modifier. So let's go first add a subdivision surface like that. And let's smooth it out a little bit more. So we'll say like 3 there, and we can right click shade auto smooth. So that is looking pretty good. Let's come to the side view, and I want to hit S to scale that down a little bit. Of course, I want to come here, hit tab, and do our one thing real quick. So rotate that so that it's basically on the floor plane. So somewhere like right there. And then of course we want both sides of this to be touching the floor plane. And so right around there, you can see this side is touching. We do want to do that to the subdivision and not the actual, geometry data and stuff. So now that that's on the floor plane, let's position it where we want it. So I'm going to click this, hit H to hide. Let's scale that down a little bit. And then I'm just going to rotate that like right there. That is looking pretty good. And so now you can see that if I have this scene, we basically have the monkey being tracked now. And so that's really nice and looks really good and everything. Now let's get into some of the lighting and stuff. Let's come back out here. Of course, I do want transparency in my scene like I had shown you before. So File, Transparent. So now we can see the monkey. Of course, there is no lighting in our scene. So let's go ahead and add some area lights, and let's come up here to light. We'll add an area light like that. Now this is where I can, take some measurements of my actual room that I shot in and get super precise. So right here, I'll notice if I go to the top view, let's make the light as small as my lights in the real world. So if I come over here, we can play around with this size. Now the light I shot in was roughly like around this size, so 0.8 is just a common kind of light bulb size. So something like that. Of course, it wasn't directly on the table. It was about, say like 6 feet or something above my actual thing. And so that, I believe, converted into meters is about 1.8. So what I can do is just come over here. If I hit Z, I can move it in the Z. This is kind of the, measurement tool. So let's measure out 1.8. So 1.8 is like right there. And so that's how high the actual light needs to be. And so we'll place it like up here. Okay, so now that we have the actual light, at the correct kind of distance from my monkey, what we can do is come up here. And then what I'm going to do is set the correct wattage, because now that we have the scene correctly scaled, we can actually use real world numbers to influence lighting, and hopefully it's going to match as accurately as possible. So I know from my light bulb, since I installed them myself, we're going to do 60 watts. And so that looks good. You will notice right here, that is way too much for a monkey. And so what you can see and notice is that basically that we have a lot of blown out white bits. And that goes back to the color kind of view transform that I was talking about earlier. The best kind of view transform for CGI inside of here is, of course, AGX. So let's set it back to AGX, and now it looks much better. And so I guess you're asking, how do we actually get the benefits of AGX for our CGI and then standard for our kind of 2D passes and stuff like that? And basically what we're going to end up doing is we're going to render out a kind of CG pass, a image pass of the monkey, and we're going to take that pass into a whole nother Blender program and then reset our view transform to standard and then do our compositing in standard. That way, once we basically have the CGI rendered as a image sequence, both of our image sequence and then also our footage is going to be in the same kind of color transform. And so that's how we're going to kind of maintain the color data inside of Blender. You basically have to use one program of Blender for just the kind of CGI and stuff like that, and then another program of Blender for the compositing. And so it'll get very kind of complicated stuff in that. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible for the sake of this kind of course being targeted towards the beginner side of things. And so let's come up here. If I, am looking in the real world of where I actually have the lights, I'll notice I have basically one here. I have one in the back here. I basically have one kind of on the side right here. And then I have two over here. So 1 and 2. It's a very odd lighting setup. I don't know who actually positioned the lights, but that's kind of where the lighting was in our actual scene. And so let's go ahead and position some of those lights there. So of course, G-Shift-Z, going to position that light there. And it is going to be facing down. And so we can just leave it kind of pointed straight down. So now that we have that, let's go, instead of Shift-D is the kind of keyboard shortcut to actually duplicate. What I'm actually going to do, since all of my lights were actually the same exact bulb, what I can do is I can have, instead of duplicates, things that are called instances. And so with duplicates, I can have different settings between the different lights. So this light I changed up to a crazy number, but that number hasn't been affected in our original light. I actually want, since all of mine are the same, it'll not only save me some render time, but also save me some time, because whatever kind of settings I place here, it'll automatically update to all of the lights at the very same time. So in order to do that, instead of, again, Shift-D is to duplicate, we want to create an instance. So that is Alt-D. So if we hold Alt and then press D, we now have another light, but now whatever setting that we affect in this light is also going to be applied to this light. So if I click between the two, now you can see both of the settings are the exact same. And so that's going to be really useful to actually, do one light and have one setting and affect all of the particular lights. So let's go ahead and place some of the others. So again, Alt-D, Alt-D, and then Alt-D right there. These are kind of just rough positions like that. You can, of course, get exact measurements if you want, but let's see what that is looking like. You can now see that we have much more light in our scene and stuff like that. It is a little too much, and so, of course, the wattage isn't perfect to the real world. So let's actually turn this down a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good and matches our scene pretty nicely. So like a 27, we'll just stick it to 30 right now. So with a 30, of course, we can't see our shadow. So let's come back to the plane. Now for the plane, one thing I want you to know is that when we have anything that's set as a shadow catcher, it's still going to affect the bounce lighting and the contact lighting of our actual object. And so right now, if I set this, we'll go add a new material just for demonstration purposes. I'll set it to be a red color. Now you can see on the monkey, there's a lot of red light bouncing. Even if we set it to that shadow catcher, so again, visibility shadow catcher, you can see that we're still seeing that red light. So we basically need to, project a texture onto this thing that's going to be the texture of the footage, just so we can get accurate light, bounce lighting, and accurate reflections and stuff like that. And so in order to do that, let's bring our handy dandy window out here and go to shader editor. Hit N to hide that. And now what I want to do is let's go ahead and unhide the shadow real quick. I basically want to, again, project the texture onto this plane. And so that's super easy. Again, if you have the Node Wrangler add-on installed, so edit, preferences, add-ons, and then Node Wrangler, like I showed you earlier, we want that installed and checked. And with that, what we can do is we can go ahead and, Shift-A, we're going to add a image texture. Let's place that there and then go to the color, to the base color. And then if we open up a image, what we want to do is locate the actual footage image sequence that we rendered out before. So hit A just like that and open the image. Now you can see that we actually have the image of the footage projected onto it. Of course, it's not set to kind of auto refresh. So let's go ahead and auto refresh that. And so it updates to the current frame of everything. And so that is looking good. And now you can see the texture is actually moving. Of course, it's not correctly aligned. And so that's where we can come in here. And with the Node Wrangler add-on I just showed you, we can hold Control and T. And I'll add a texture coordinate and mapping node. And so you're going to be using these a lot inside of your processes if you're, a material guy or even in the compositing tab. So let's go ahead, instead of UV of, this is the UV of the actual plane that it's using, we're going to instead go to window. And so with window, basically wherever we're viewing it from, it's actually going to project that texture from that angle. So if we actually view it from the camera's point of view, it's basically using the camera as a projector, if you want to think of it like that. And so that is the exact result that we want. Of course, it's not lining up perfectly. And so what I actually like to do is let's come up here and go, instead of outline selected, let's turn that off just so we can see this seam. Of course, you do want to make sure your camera background images opacity is all the way up, just so we can get the accurate match there. Let's go ahead and come here, and I want to try to match that as closely as possible. First thing is that we're getting a lot of the reflections of the actual lights in the scene. So let's increase the roughness all the way, and then I'm going to decrease the specular all the way. So it just gets out some of the reflection data of the actual lights that it's producing. Next thing we need to do is go ahead and add a gamma node. So gamma node is going to help us match this section much more closely and kind of crush some of those values a little bit. So let's increase that until we get kind of a good fall off. So something around like here, you can see that it's matching much more closely to the actual footage. Of course, it doesn't have to match exactly, and that's actually because we're, again, only using this to do reflections and lighting and make sure we have accurate bounce lighting. And so that looks pretty good and, you know, matches, you know, somewhat well to the footage now. And so now let's go back. I'm going to turn my outline selected back on. So right there. And now what we can do is we can turn back on the kind of visibility shader shadow catcher. So now what that's allowed us to do, say if we make this monkey, we'll make this monkey kind of like a gray metallic color. We'll introduce some roughness and stuff, something like that. I might make it a little bit like that. There we go. So now it's like basically a metallic gray color. What we can do is we can like move it around this entire kind of section. And if you see right here, if I move it on the table, now we're actually having the bounce light of the table onto it. And so that's really nice to actually get kind of real world reflection data and stuff into it. And so this is looking pretty good. Let's actually go ahead and break it down and start thinking about how we're going to composite everything back together. And so for my compositing, what I like to do is I always like to have multiple passes in compositing. So I basically want one pass where it's just the monkey, and then I want a separate pass that's just dealing with the shadows and everything. So let's go ahead and talk about how to break that down. So down in the compositing section, we can go ahead and delete the movie clip and alpha overnode, and we'll just go and view the render layers. Now the render layers, what we can do is if we duplicate it, we can actually determine different view layers in our scene and you know, view them separately. So we have this foreground view layer right now. You can see that's the only view layer that we have in our scene. Of course, we can come out to Layout tab, and then we can add a new view layer. So if I come up here, let's add a new view layer real quick, and I'll name this one like Shadow, for instance. So now in the compositing section, we can now change foreground to shadow. And so now we basically have two duplications of our scene that we can render out different things with. So let's come back out to layout. And basically what I want to do is I want to break up my monkey and my shadow kind of objects into different collections. And so collections are basically folders inside of the outliner that we can do kind of different stuff to in order to render out passes. And so let's go ahead and right click. I'm going to add a couple new collections. I'm going to name this one monkey, and we'll name this one shadow. And so, of course, let's place the correct objects in there. So Suzanne goes into the monkey collection, and then our plane goes into the shadow collection. And so that is looking pretty good. Of course, we want to go back to our foreground first, and let's do the monkey first. I'm just going to name this foreground view layer monkey. And so with our monkey, we basically want this shadow object to indirectly affect the monkey. And so we still want to use this as reflection data and like some bounce light and contact shadows and all that kind of good stuff. So in order to actually do that, let's come up here and press this button. These are a bunch of filters you can do for collections and stuff like that. The one that we're going to use is the indirect only filter. And so what that allows us to do is on any of the collections now, you can see this little arrow kind of icon right there. And now what that allows us to do is, you know, turn on indirect only for a collection. So for the shadow collection, let's turn that on. And now you can see that we're basically having the reflections of our shadow collection. So that object that we made before. However, we can't actually see the shadow anymore. And so that is exactly what we want. And, you know, is giving us the monkey without the shadows in our render. And so again, that's the monkey view layer. Let's go to the shadow view layer right here. And of course, we want to do the opposite. We want the monkey to now be indirectly affecting. And so, of course, that applies to shadows, reflections, bounce lighting, anything like that, that kind of the object automatically indirectly affects is what it's going to affect. So now we basically have a transparent kind of monkey pass inside of here. And so that is exactly what we want. Now we can come into the compositing tab. And if we go ahead and render out a image. Okay, so once it's black, let's come out of here, and you can see that we now have our monkey and then also our shadow. And so that is very good. And now we have correctly broken them up into different things, so we have more flexibility in compositing. So now let's go ahead and render out everything. Now you could, plug one thing into the composite node, render out that entire thing, update some settings, and then, plug this one into the composite node. That just takes a lot of time and, is very annoying. If you're going to be rendering this overnight or anything, the kind of way I like to work is we're going to Shift A, we're going to add a file output node. And so file output basically replaces the composite node, if you want to think of it like that. But what it does is it allows us to have multiple things rendered at the same time. So if you come up to the node section up here and go down to properties, we can now add different inputs and stuff. And so that's going to be really useful to, speed up our kind of workflow. So let's go ahead, and we need two things since we're only rendering out two passes. So I'm going to plug the image of our monkey into that, and then the image of our shadow into that. And so of course I can name them. Let's name this one monkey. Then I'm going to do an underscore to separate the text from the actual frame number. And of course down here, let's do shadow underscore like that. Now I'm just going to be saving them as PNG sequences, so just keep it as a PNG file. We do need alpha this time, and of course the compression ratio, depending on how long you actually have to render, you can play around with that since PNG is lossless. So now that we have that, you do of course want to select a base path where you want this to render to. Very important to know is that we do have to keep the composite node in here. For some reason, the file output node does not work if the composite node isn't in here, just kind of like a little bug type thing. So you can just have it like kind of unplugged and hanging up here. Of course, if you do ever want to change any of the output properties, instead of coming to the output section, because again, this output section only goes to the composite node, we want to click the file output node and do all of our output properties here. And so that's just kind of a little bit of a different workflow than what typically you would do. And so now that we have everything set up in the file output node, what we can do is come up here and render the animation. Okay, so whenever both of those are finished rendering, what we can do is come up to file, and we want to open up a new general project. And again, this is the project that we're actually going to be compositing everything in. And so let's come to the compositing tab. Let's bring this down. We can add use nodes. And since we're not going to be rendering anything in the 3D layout section, we can go ahead and delete this render layers node. Let's Shift A. I want to add a image node right here. And we need to import in all of our images. And so our two passes and then our footage. So let's go ahead and open up. First, we'll do our footage. So right here, our image sequence, we're going to hit A and open that. Let's go ahead and duplicate that down. I want to go ahead and open up our passes now. And so let's locate wherever you saved your actual passes. So mine are right here. And so we have this monkey pass. So let's do the monkey first. So I'm going to come down and select all of my monkey frames right here. And so let's just shift and click those. So let's open that image, and then let's duplicate that one more time. And we just want to select the shadow passes now. And so let's select that first shadow pass frame here, and then all the way down to 198 there. So let's open up both of those images. Let's go ahead and composite them now. So of course, let's Shift A, we're going to add a alpha over node and combine both of those. We're going to do our monkey on top of our footage, so like that, and then Shift Control click to add a viewer node. Now again, you will see that we're having that same color issue as before, and that is because by default Blender automatically sets the view transform to be AGX, since it's going to assume that we're going to be dealing with 3D objects and stuff like that. So let's come back out to the color management tab, and this is where we finally want to do standard, and the whole reason we're kind of doing this process. Now you can see that both of our monkey pass and our footage pass is in the correct color space for Blender, and so now we can actually get accurate colors and make sure that they match as accurately as possible. And so now that we have this, you will see, if I zoom in now, we have this kind of weird white outline to our monkey, and that is actually to do with the pre-multiplication of Blender. And so we have this alpha section, and so basically in all of compositing software such as Blender, Nuke, DaVinci, all these compositing softwares, they will have pre-multiplication, and all that means is it's going to take this black and white kind of mask section, and it's going to apply it to our footage, because right now this is kind of the default kind of image without the alpha applied. And so all you need to know is, in order to do that, we can either hit this convert pre-multiply button, which is totally fine and something that you can totally do. However, what I actually like to do is have a dedicated node for that, because basically when we're compositing, what we want to do is we want to do all of our color kind of manipulation, like hue saturation, if we're doing any color grades, color corrections, anything like that. We want that to happen before we actually pre-multiply everything. Without getting too complicated into it, the reason we do that is because we actually have this extra border of kind of buffer. So that is what this kind of white area is. It's basically just like a little bit of a border, if you want to think. And so if we're doing any color corrections or anything like that, it's basically just going to give us a little bit of buffer to go ahead and color correct that. Because sometimes if you don't, what you'll find is that when you add your color correction and stuff, there'll actually be kind of like a black outline around your object, and it looks super ugly and stuff like that. And so that's just kind of how us visual effects artists kind of get rid of that, is doing a pre-multiplication kind of method. And so let's go ahead. I'm going to add it as its own node. So we're going to Shift A, we're going to add, if you type in alpha, what we want is this alpha convert. And so if we plug that there, you can see it's basically already set to the exact thing we need, 2 pre-multiplied. And so now we have basically pre-multiplied our alpha channel onto this pass. And so now we have it like that. And so that is the workflow to do that. Now, you might be thinking, how do we actually add in our shadow? And so what we could do is we could, let's duplicate, Shift D, duplicate this alpha over up, and we can add our shadow below our monkey layer. And so that's a totally fine way to do it. However, it's not the most accurate or my preferred method of actually doing it. And so what we can do, let's go ahead and undo that process that we just did. What I want to use is I basically want to use the pixel data of the actual footage. And so what that means is that we can use this alpha mask that it automatically generated. And this is the alpha of our shadow. And so we can use this mask to basically influence the color data of the original footage. So to do that inside of Blender, let's Shift A. I'm going to add in a color balance node. So right here, color balance, I'm going to put that up here into our kind of stream for our footage. So then let's plug this alpha into the factor, because that's basically going to tell where we actually want to affect the color of our footage. We don't want to affect the entire footage. We just want to affect the shadow parts of our footage. So now that we have this, we can play around with the lift, game, and game a little bit. So I'm going to move this down a little bit, and then we'll move that there. And now you can see it's giving us kind of more, flexibility for the actual shadow. And I just like kind of doing this process a lot better. So it's a little too blue right now. So I'm going to actually bring that a little bit down so they match a little bit more. It could also bring this and make this opposite of blue. So basically, in this color wheel, blue is over here. I'm going to go to the opposite side of blue to remove some of that blue. So now you can see it's in the yellow or the orange or whatever there. And now it's removing some of that blue. And so that is perfectly exactly what I want. Now I do want to blur this a little bit. You will see that we're having some noise and stuff in it. I actually didn't denoise the shadow pass, so I could go back and denoise that and render that out, but what I'm actually going to do instead is just Shift A. I'm going to blur it a little bit. So add a blur node, we'll plug that in between our alpha and factor, and then if I we'll go to fast Gaussian and just increase this to something like, we'll do like a 4 pixel blur. So like that. So that just basically blurs it a little bit and gets some of that noise out that we would have. And so now we basically have this. We do need to set the correct N keyframe. So if you remember in our footage, it was 198. And so we can set that down here. Of course, we do need to plug this final alpha over into our composite. And we are actually ready to render out the final animation with our visual effects complied and composited in. And so we can come, let's go to the output properties, since now we can actually render it back out to a video file, just to, view it easier if you're uploading it to Instagram, YouTube, anywhere that you're uploading it. All of those require video files instead of image sequences. So let's come to the output properties. Of course, select wherever you want this to actually render to. And so once you have named it, we can hit accept here. And then file format, we're going to do FFmpeg video. And then in encoding, you can render out however you want. I'm going to do a MP4 file, so MPEG-4, and then I'm going to leave it as H.264 as the codec, which is totally fine for my specific needs. And then we can go ahead and do high quality settings. These are kind of just the most basic settings for uploading to the internet. And so now that we have all of this stuff, we can go ahead and come up here and render the animation one final time. Okay, so here is the final result that we got from this chapter as our first ever visual effects shot that we have done inside of Blender. You can see that we have our monkey with our shadow pass. We have separated our monkey and shadow pass. And then we're actually camera tracking that into the scene with the correct reflections, and all of that is looking good. So hopefully you guys got a similar result and, really learned some stuff. I know this is a super long long chapter, and I apologize. I just wanted to go over all the basics, and I promise in the later chapters, we'll speed things up a little bit and get into some more advanced stuff that we can do inside of Blender. But hopefully this does set you up for success in the later chapters to come. Again, in chapter 2, we're going to be dealing everything camera tracking and really diving into some settings there. Chapter 3 is going to be all about planar tracking and some of the cool stuff that we can achieve with that inside of Blender. And then finally, we're going to be doing a whole dedicated chapter to for a super awesome visual effects shot. So I'm super excited to be showing you guys, and hopefully you are excited as well to jump into Blender and really hit the ground running in terms of visual effects. So thanks so much for sticking with me, and I'm excited to jump into chapter 2.